The Smoking Iron by Peter Field. Chapter 1. Pat Stevens hooked the last trace on the double tree of the buckboard and stepped back from the team of matching bays. He brushed the dust from his hands with a bandana and thrust it back into the left hip pocket of his blue jeans, and then turned to look up the slope towards the door of the Lazy Mare ranch house. The door was still closed, and there wasn't any sign of Sally. Pat shook his head and sighed ruefully while he tried to keep the feeling of irritation down. It was the middle of the afternoon, and Sally wasn't yet ready for the weekly trip into Dutch Springs for supplies. He had purposely taken his time about harnessing the team and doing a lot of little things that didn't really need doing, just to give her more leeway so she'd be ready to leave by the time he was finished. But she was probably inside primping, trying to decide which sunbonnet to wear into Dutch Springs, he reckoned. A slow grin replaced the begin of a scowl on Pat's sun-bronzed face. It was like this every week, by golly. They'd been married a dozen years now, but Sally still felt she had to get all primmed up like a bride just for the weekly ride into town. A man would think she wasn't satisfied with him for a husband, that she hoped to make another conquest every time she rode into town. He'd have to josh her about that while they were riding in. And then she'd blush, and he heard the door of the ranch house open hurriedly behind him and then close with a little bang. He picked up the lines and turned the bays to cramp a front wheel so his wife could get in without dirtying her skirt, and then turning with a wide grin as she ran lightly down the path towards the buckboard. She had chosen the pink sunbonnet. For a moment, he was ready to admit that maybe the primping up might be worthwhile. She looked, by golly, just like a bride, only prettier than most of the white girls around Powder Valley. He decided he wouldn't josh her about the idea of looking for another husband. Might give her an idea, and she was too darn pretty. As she came up to the buckboard, Sally Stevens asked breathlessly, "Are you all ready? My, you got hitched up pretty fast." Pat got rid of the grin and said kind of gravely, "I've got to be fast to keep up with you. Most wives I've heard tell are likely to keep their men waiting while they get all primmed up for the trip into town, but danged if you didn't just throw on any old thing like that pink sunbonnet and you're all ready." Sally looked at him searchingly, and then touched the bonnet with anxious fingers. "Does it not look all right? I can go back and get the blue one." "Oh, you need not bother," Pat told her hastily. He took her hand to help her into the seat. "For an old woman like yourself, you do all right." He tightened the lines and stepped up the hub to slide into the seat beside her. Sally Stevens turned her head to look at the sound of a trotting horse coming from behind them. She put her hand on his arm and said, "Wait a minute, Pat. Someone's riding up from the south." Pat said, "Probably just one of the boys," but turned to look behind them as well. He pushed his hat back and grunted his surprise as he recognized the figure of the approaching rider. "Looked like Tom Thurston's boy." "It is, Pat, and he's spurring his horse up now so he sees us waiting. He's probably got a grocery list from Miss Thurston for us to get in town." "And he rode his horse down to a frazzle getting here," muttered Pat, disapproving. He scowled darkly and held team up a bays and waited until the young man approached on a badly winded black gelding. Ben Thurston was 20 years old, but he looked much younger with a bit of unshaven fuzz on his pumply cheeks and with his slight figure sitting awkwardly in the big stock saddle. He had been back east to college for 2 years and had absorbed a lot of city ways while away from Colorado. Instead of the conventional range attire of any other youth in the valley, he wore a tight-waisted city pants, and a pink-white striped shirt with a yeller silk bandana knotted loosely about his neck, and a narrow-brimmed white Panama hat on his head. The fancy headgear wasn't very effective in keeping the western sun from his face, and there was ugly red patches of blistering skin between his pimples on his thin cheeks. He jerked his tired mount up roughly as he came to the side of the buckboard and panted, "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Stevens," out of cracked lips.
Pat replied, "Hello, Ben.
"Going to college ain't taught you much about taking care of your saddle horse on a hot day like this." Ben shrugged his thin shoulders and snorted thinly. "Oh, what's a horse for but to ride? I was hurrying to catch you before you started out for town."
"I suppose your mother sent you a grocery list?"
Sally leaned past Pat with a smile that was designed to take some of the sting from her husband's gruff manner.
"We'll be glad to get whatever she wants, Ben."
"It's more important than that, Miss Stevens. A lot more important." The youth twisted sideways in the saddle and reached in his hip pocket to pull out a white envelope. "I got a letter here I'd sure like for you to mail in time to catch the Pony Express." Pat reached for the letter, and Sally laughed softly and asked,
"A letter for your sweetheart back east, Ben?"
He flushed painfully and shook his head and tried to look important. "No, ma'am, it's a girl, all right, but not back east." He hesitated, then went on boastfully, "She's depending on me, you see. She'll be waiting mighty anxious until that letter comes telling her I'll be coming to help her." Pat Stevens shrugged impatiently and said, "All right, Ben, we'll see." But Sally nudged him and interrupted.
"Sounds awfully interesting, Ben. Are you going to be taking a trip?"
"It sure is interesting, just like a story out of a book." It was clear that Ben was dying to tell them all about the mysterious letter and the girl. He leaned forward over the saddle horn and explained confidentially, "She's in mighty trouble, and she figures I'm the only one that can help her out. Naturally, a man can't turn down an appeal like that." Pat snorted over the boy's use of the word man, but Sally nudged him again and urged Ben on with an eager question.
"Who's the girl, and what kind of trouble's she in?"
"Her name's Katie Rollins. It's written right here on the envelope. I guess maybe you've heard of the KT Ranch down on the Mexican border." He looked at Pat for confirmation. So Pat grunted. "Yeah, I've heard of the Katie spread, all right. What's she writing you for?" "Well, that's where the storybook part of it comes in," Ben told them eagerly. "My pa and Jim Rollins used to be partners back about 40-50 years ago." He waved his hand vaguely. "They wrote letters back and forth every 3 or 4 years maybe, until maybe 10 years ago. And they had a joke betwixt them that when Katie Rollins and I got old enough, why, we'd get married. It was kind of a joke, of course." He went on hastily, blushing again. "But when Katie's pa died last year, the last thing he told her was that if she ever got up against anything she couldn't handle, she was to write to my pa for help. And that's what she did last week," he ended triumphantly.
"Well, it is like a storybook," Sally agreed excitedly. "It's as romantic as everything. I suppose she's awfully pretty and a rich heiress. You'll fall in love with her at first sight and get married just like your father's planned."
"Oh, she's pretty, all right." The bright red blush stayed on Ben Thurston's face as he dug into his shirt pocket for a small photograph. "She sent this along with her letter." He offered them the picture. Pat took it from Ben's hand and held it for Sally to see. The girl was pretty, though more than merely facial prettiness looked at Pat and his wife from Katie Rollins' picture. She had a firm chin and a wide mouth with just the faintest hint of a smile turned up on the outer corners of her lips. Her eyes were wide-spaced and very grave, with sort of a breathless appeal about them, a look of expectancy, a serene belief that the world was good and the life held much in store for her. Pat Stevens felt his thumb and forefinger tighten on the little bit of cardboard between them. The girl was looking directly into his eyes, and a queer pain of remembering tugged at his heart as he stared back. He turned his head slowly, and saw the laughter had gone out of Sally's face close to his. Pat looked at Sally as though he hadn't seen her for a long time, and then turned back to the young man on the horse. "What kind of trouble you say this girl's got, Ben?" "I don't know. It must be something pretty bad. She's said she couldn't write it all in a letter, but she's terribly afraid of something, and doesn't know where else to get help from but her old father's partner. So Pa said I better get on the stage and get right out there to see about it. I'm going to be taking his old gun with me because it might be rustlers and something on the border," he added importantly. "You going on the stage?" Pat asked in surprise. "Sure. That letter you got tells her I'll get to Marfa next Friday. Marfa's where I get off the stage from El Paso and catch another to Hermas. There's where she lives." "You could ride it in less than a week instead of going all the way around by stage," Pat muttered. The young man shrugged and then said, "It's a mighty hard ride on horseback. I figure I'll save my strength by riding on stagecoach. That way I'll be in better shape to cope with danger when I get there." Pat snorted something indistinguishable and handed the photograph back to Ben Thurston. He said shortly, "We'll mail your letter to Dutch Springs," and then shook the lines out over the backs of the impatient team. They swung away in an eager trot, then into a lope as they felt no restraining hand upon the lines. Sally relaxed against her husband and began laughing softly.
"You looked so stern and grim-faced, Pat. What's the matter?"
"Riding by stagecoach," he muttered. "If that gal's in any real trouble, God pity her, depending on a sissy like Ben Thurston. Him and his daddy's old gun. I bet you he doesn't even know which end shoots." Sally stopped laughing and snuggled against him.
"These are different times from when you were young, Pat. Likely enough the girl's trouble isn't anything that requires gunplay. Maybe she's got mice in her burro's drawer."
"Not that gal," Pat muttered. "She wouldn't be writing letters for any man to help her get rid of mice."
"I know," Sally said instantly. "I didn't really mean that, Pat."
She hesitated.
She is awfully pretty."
"She's more than pretty, and you know it," Pat told her angrily. "That gal's got plenty of nerve. If she says she's in trouble, I bet you it's real trouble." He tightened his grip on the lines and spoke soothingly to the bays and slowly brought them down from a gallop to a fast trot. Sally sat up and nodded thoughtfully.
"I had the queerest feeling when I looked at her picture, as if I ought to recognize it, as if I'd known her someplace."
"You know why?" Pat didn't look at his wife.
"No, I can't imagine, Pat. We certainly never met her."
Sally looked at him in surprise. "She looks like you, Sally. Like you looked 12 years ago."
"Oh, no, you're imagining things, Pat. Why, that girl's a brunette and her eyes are brown."
"No matter about that," he insisted stubbornly. "It was the way I was looking at you again, Sally. It's not the color of her eyes that counts," he went on slowly. "It's what she says with them, what shows through from the inside, from the kind of person she is. That's what I'm talking about. I'm thinking about the first time I saw you at Hopewell Junction, when you were expecting to be met by a man you were married to but hardly knew. You were scared, but you wouldn't let yourself be scared. You remember that day, Miss Stevens?"
As though I would ever forget that, Pat.
Sally put one hand on his hard forearm, and her fingers tightened there. She was silent for a moment, and then she recalled dreamily,
"As soon as I saw you, I knew I'd never be frightened again, Pat. I knew then and there everything would be all right."
"And then this gal is waiting for Ben Thurston to get off the stage," Pat muttered. "You reckon she's going to feel that way as soon as she sees him?" Sally puckered her lips to laugh, but no laughter came forth. She sighed and said, a sad, rueful sigh,
"You're making me feel sorry for her, depending on Ben for help, but that's silly," she went on brightly. "Katie Rollins won't be needing the kind of man I needed. Things have changed in the last 12 years. She can't be in any real danger."
"The Katy Ranch lies on the big bend of the Rio Grande," Pat told her quietly.
"But that's still the United States. There's law there."
"You don't know much about the Big Bend," Pat said harshly.
"What about it?"
"The more civilized the rest of the country has got in the last few years, the worse the Big Bend has got. It's right there handy on the border, the real owl hoot trail leading south. The next town of Barranco ain't far from Hermosa, where this letter's addressed to, and Barranco is a hideout for outlaws and killers. The only law in the Big Bend," he added grimly, "is what a man carries on his own hip." Sally shrank away from him on the buckboard seat with a little cry of dismay.
"Ben Thurston won't be good in a place like that."
"That," agreed Pat quietly, "that is what I'm thinking." The team of bays went on towards Dutch Springs at a fast trot. Sitting safe and secure beside her husband in the rocking buckboard, Sally Stevens' thoughts went back over the decade that was behind them. Powder Valley had not been a safe nor secure place 12 years before when she first came to live here. Then the only law in that part of Colorado had been what a man carried in a leather holster. Pat Stevens had had a large part in changing things to what they are now. Pat and his two partners, Sam Sloan and one huge fella with one eye named Ezra. The guns of those three had built up a real respect for the force of decency and order in the valley. Not always legally, but always fighting for the right, the trio had cleaned up the valley and made it into a safe place where a man could rear a family. With a little shudder, she realized this same thing had been going on all over the West at the same time. In countless other communities, other men like Pat and his partners had been making other places safe for law-abiding folk. The outlaws and gunmen had been driven to find refuge some other place. Places like the Big Bend of Rio Grande, where the proximity of the Mexican border offered them refuge. Without quite realizing the import of her words, Sally said,
"It's too bad you, Sam, and Ezra have broken up your threesome. Going to rescue of Kate Rollins in the Big Bend is just the sort of thing you three would have jumped at 10 years ago."
"I was sort of thinking on the same thing," he admitted regrettably. "But I'm all settled down here with a wife that's getting old with a growing boy."
"I'm not so old," Sally flashed at him.
Pat grinned slyly. "Too old to be sending your husband off on some foolishness like that."
"Of course," Sally agreed strongly, "it would be foolish."
Pat slapped his lines on the back of the slick bays to speed their trot a wee. He didn't say anything.
"Besides," said Sally, "Sam Sloan is married now and hardly over his honeymoon, and he's got that important job riding the Pony Express."
That's right. Poor old Sam, he's hog-tied for sure. Pat shook his head sadly from side to side. Sally darted him a quick glance, but his expression only sorrow for the plight of his one-time gun partner.
And Ezra's settled down and working too, she reminded him. Taking care of that Pony Express station, he can't go trip-peeping off into the foolish adventures anymore.
No, he surely can't. Not unless he's got somebody to take his place at the station. Makes me feel kind of sorry for Ezra, Pat went on feelingly. He ain't never been tied down like that before with a steady job.
But it's good for him, Sally said sternly.
Sure it is, Pat agreed in a meek tone. I reckon. Sally said nothing for a long time. She sat erect on the seat, tapping her toe against the floor of the buckboard and staring straight ahead, her lips compressed tightly. Glancing aside at her from time to time, Pat couldn't see her face, hidden as it was by the pink sunbonnet. He wondered what she was thinking about. He found out after a short time. In a curiously muffled voice, she asked hesitantly,
"Do you still plan to pick up some of those 2-year-old heifers to stock the south pasture this fall?"
I ain't rightly decided. Not at the price a man has to pay hereabouts for heifers. Another short pause followed, and then,
"Have you thought any more about picking up some cheap Mexican stock down on the border?"
I've been thinking about it a little bit, he replied carefully. I ain't plumb sure it's worth making a trip that far just to see if a man can pick up a bargain, though.
"Seems to me," said Sally strongly, "that it would be well worth it. That south pasture's hardly grazed at all last winter. It's a waste to let the grass lie."
That's right, I reckon it is.
"If you're hesitant about making a buying trip on my account, I wish you wouldn't,"
Sally told him primly.
"Doc and I will get along fine on the ranch without you."
I sort of hate to go alone, Pat confessed. It's a long ride down into Texas.
"You could go by stagecoach."
Sure, and a goat could fly if the Lord had give him wings.
"What about Ezra?"
I don't know if I should mention it to him. Oh, he'd like to go like a shot, but maybe he oughtn't to leave his Pony Express station, being the first steady job he ever held down.
"But you said he could likely get someone to take care of the station if he went on a trip."
I reckon he could.
"Please, Pat."
Sally's voice throbbed strongly. She laid her hand on his arm.
"I think you should."
Go for a buying trip for heifers?
"Yes, down by the Big Bend."
Pat said wonderingly, I'll never be able to figure you out, old lady. You're always one jump ahead of me. He put his arm over her shoulders and his palm against her sunbonnet cheek. He turned her and crushed her into him and forced the sunbonnet back on her head, giving her a big old kiss. End of chapter 1.